Today is April 28th, 2008. I am Eric Michnick, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Fargo, North Dakota. Could you please state your full name, including your middle name and your maiden name?
My full name is Elsie Louise Just Johnson.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in a rural house on a farm at Cumberland, Wisconsin, May 27th, 1919.
Okay. Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
No, I haven't. Just that I was the last one on the family of 12, and now that I'm the last surviving member of the family, I have no one to talk to give me any idea about what had happened. But I was probably loved because I was the baby sister, and I always had wonderful relationships with all my siblings.
Okay. Was a midwife or a doctor present at your birth?
I don't know. I didn't talk about it with my mother. My understanding was that neighbors helped out neighbors, and if the doctor didn't get there on time, they would help, and then the doctor would come and sign the birth certificate and register the birth of the children. And I have my birth certificate.
Okay. Could you please share some of your earliest memories with us?
My earliest memories, I think, would be when I was sitting in my high chair between my father and my mother at a big family table. It was in the kitchen. We didn't have a dining room. Those days we had a large family room or a large kitchen with a stove in the dining room, and it was always interesting at mealtime because we always ate meals together, that I remember. And I had 4 brothers, older than, and I was teased, no doubt, but I was also loved. I didn't feel that I was ever abused by any of them. Probably they got the best chicken, but I got enough to eat.
Okay. Let's discuss a little bit about your family now. Could you please tell me about your grandparents on your father's side?
On my father's side, as I understand it, my grandfather came from the Poland in 1863 or so, and was a colonist in the Ukraine. And I've had a little difficulty to pin down exactly where they first lived, but my father was born in Neudorf, and I couldn't find that on any map. And then when I did look it up, they said there were 2 Neudorfs. One was in 1811, and then there wasn't anything else said about it. And I have his birth certificate that said that he was born September 3rd, 1874, and that was under the Julian calendar. So then they decided that later, when they came to the United States, they celebrated the birthday 2 weeks later. So he had 2 birthdays, the 17th and the 3rd of September. It wasn't so hard to celebrate because he'd be very satisfied with the corncob pipe or probably a glass of vodka.
What is the Julian calendar?
The calendar?
Yeah, the different
Well,
calendar.
Julian calendar, I understand, was Julius Caesar in, I don't remember when. Was it BC that that was the Julian calendar? And then the other one was the I forgot what the other name is. I have it written down. Sometimes there's a little lack between the brain and the oral. It'll come to me during my sleep tonight.
Okay. What were your grandparents' names?
My grandfather was Samuel, and his wife was Carolina.
And what was their last name?
They were Just. The last name was Just.
Okay.
Some called it or pronounced it Just, but on the passenger list in the ship that came on and all the correspondence, it was always Just.
Okay. Could you tell us what type of person your grandmother was?
I didn't know them, and I don't have a picture of my grandmother. And the picture of my grandfather, Samuel, was taken during the First War, I understand, and he was 92. He was a widower at one time, but I understand that in his 80s, late 80s, he married again, and we don't have any knowledge of what happened to him because during the war, later he was he was killed.
Okay.
And as far as my grandmother, we have nothing about her except a little. Probably my father said something about it, but now we've forgotten. After all this time, we had so many other cousins and aunts and uncles and to talk about.
Did you know anything of your grandparents from your mother's side?
On my mother's side, my mother's father, I understand, came from Poland to the Ukraine earlier than my father's family. It seemed that they had a farm and was very productive and had several children, and then his wife died. Then he remarried, and the second wife was my mother's mother.
Okay.
And her name was Rosalie Yeski.
Could you spell that, please?
I believe it's Jeschke.
Okay. Did those grandparents come over to the United States from Russia?
No. I often said to Mama, "Why did you come alone?" Because she had no relatives over here. It was only through her husband and through friends that had come earlier. And she said, "I wanted a better life for my children. I want a better life for my children." And there's going to be some war coming. It would be about the time of revolutionary times, and she wanted to get out of Russia. So she persuaded her husband, my father, who had a sister over here and a brother and a cousin in the United States. So that's why they came.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit about your mother?
My mother?
Yeah.
I owe everything to my mother, really, because I think of her thinking about ahead for her children, that they would have freedom, they would be able to get an education that she didn't have any opportunity to have over there, because the only thing that was available is to get married young, have kids, have children, and that's about it.
Okay. And what was her name?
Her name was Rosalie. My father called her Rosella. I never heard him say mama, ma, like sometimes husbands call their wives mama because of the children, but it was always.
Okay. And where and when was she born?
She was born February 23rd, 1881.
Okay. did she express her emotions such as fear, love, and anger?
Well, I always knew I was loved, but they were not always the hugging or the kissing kind, because Germans are rather stoic and non-expressive at times, unless they're angry or they have something important to discuss. Then their emotions get a little bit carried away. But I never heard my mother and father have any arguments. They'd have differences of opinion, and couldn't tell you who won, but it was some discussions, mostly discussions. But they didn't discuss in front of us very much about their life in the Ukraine, because I think they wanted to forget some of that and become Americanized and have that freedom for our children. It was kind of that we had to ask them about anything about them if we want. And of course, when you're a child, you're not that interested. It's only when you get older and then you know what you've missed.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you owe everything to your mother. Can you describe your relationship with your mother?
My relationship with my mother? We had a good relationship. The only thing I remember about a little discussion we had is she had done all of the sewing in the family, the clothes for my father wore a cadet shirt that he had kept from the time that he served in the Army. And then all of the dresses for the girls, and I don't know, the boys were able to buy bib overhauls. That's what they used. And when it came to time to teach me how to sew, she said, "Elsie, I am so sick of sewing. I hope that you don't have to sew, that you'll be able to buy some of the clothes." And so my learning to sew was through 4-H, when I learned to draw strings and make a dish towel and an apron. So, but our relationship was good.
Okay. What was her profession?
Mother's profession? A wonderful homemaker, mother and grandmother. She was a very faithful in her faith, and she brought and taught that to us and taught us our prayers, and that was, although it was the duty of the husband to teach the children, but Mama taught us mostly in our learning to read the German and our catechism and so on.
How did she cope during hard times?
How did she cope with it?
Yeah.
I wonder how she did it. Because living on a farm, raising her children, and with all the baking, cooking, clothes under dire situations, I don't know how she did it. I couldn't do it, I don't think.
When, where, and how did she die?
How did she die? Well, when my father died, my mother came to live with us in South Dakota, and she lived with us for 17 winters. She would come, one of the brothers would bring her for pheasant hunting time in September or October. When does the pheasant hunting season open? And then she would stay with us until May, when I'd take her back to Cumberland, and then she would be with the other parts of the family. And I think that was one of the greatest blessings that she was able to, that we had that she was with us for all those winters as our children grew up. And it was that we were having 4 generations in our family for a while. And the children dearly loved her. And what her advice she would give me would be the real German way of doing it. You take care of your husband, serve him first, because he is the breadwinner in the family.
All right. When did she finally pass away?
When she died? Well, the last year she was with us, she said, Elsie, I think I will not come back with this fall. I took her to Cumberland on May 1st. She said, I'd like to stay in Cumberland this year. I think she had a premonition that she was going on to be 91. It's time that she will be, and I feel that she didn't want us to have any problem living away from Cumberland where she would be buried. And so she went home and lived in an apartment. And then one day, one of her grandchildren came to visit her, and nobody answered the door. There wasn't any sound in the apartment. So she left. But then later, my brother went in and found her in the bathroom. She had just fallen down and died. And that was, she was 90, I believe it was 1972.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your father now. What was your father's name?
My father's name was Ludwig, Ludwig, but nobody called him Ludwig. He was called Louis. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to be an American. He didn't want to have that Ludwig. And it was acceptable then to everybody.
Could you tell us a little bit about your father?
My father, yes, he had, as I say, he was born in the Ukraine. And what I don't know much about his childhood stories because I didn't ask my aunt, his sister, about it because that just wasn't important at that time. And then, but he did say that he had was drafted into the Tsar's army and was discharged, we think, at 1896 because there was a medal that he had that it was like a silver medal with a little attachment so he could wear it around his neck or on a belt or wherever. Now that medal I had until recently. I have a nephew that was the son of the one of my brothers that were born in Russia, and Glenn has that medal because I thought it should be handed down to the Just family, not to the Johnson family, because that didn't have the meaning to them as much as it did to the immigrant father of his. Well, going back to my father was a tall man, probably 6'2", and very strong, hearty, but very German in his speech to Mama all the time. He didn't. And then hard worker, honest person. When he gave his word, he didn't have to sign a contract. That was it, with a handshake and a word. He was a very hard worker. And at one time, the story that I understand is that when they first came to Iowa, that they were going to look up some land up into Canada and decided that at that time it's all prairie. no, if it doesn't grow trees, it isn't good for anything. So they came back and had a visit in Wisconsin where his sister lived. And that's the place he wanted to be. So he had that feeling of homeland. He still wanted a homeland feeling, but he also wanted to become an American.
Okay. How did he express his emotions to you, such as fear?
I think he walked out of the house, and I think he took an extra puff in his corncob pipe. He rolled his own cigarettes later. I know that he was given pipes, nice pipes, but he said, no, I like the corncob pipe. Made his own, used Albert tobacco, Prince Albert tobacco, I believe. As far as I'm thinking about farming, he was a farmer, and when he came to Wisconsin later, he came and bought an 80-acre farm. Is this what you would like,
Yeah, sure. That's
part of that? Well, I understand that when he first came to Wisconsin, they had traveled by train. I don't know exactly the route from Sheldon, Wisconsin, 1913, up to Wisconsin, and he worked for a farmer for a while until he could afford to buy his own 80 acres of land.
Can you describe your relationship with your father?
I think it was a good relationship. He always called me by a pet name, and I don't recall that we all had any real difficulties. It was really up to Mother to discipline me, I think. So it was an easy term for him. He disciplined the boys. That one I knew.
Would you like to share with us your pet name?
No, I don't think I will. Because I really don't know what it meant.
You mentioned earlier that your father was a farmer. Was that his profession for his whole life?
Yes, because my father was the youngest of, I believe it was 9 children in the Ukraine. And so as we know that the farm then would be left to the oldest son, and he being the youngest son had no possibility of owning a farm, because at the time that he was there in his 20s, it seems that you couldn't buy land anymore. So it was you'd have to go out in the territory to find work, or come to America where there was more opportunity, because the land people from America would do some advertising, come to the United States. And his cousin did come in the 1800s and settled in Kansas for a short time, and then went to Oklahoma because there was an opening called the Cherokee Outlet, I believe. And so the cousin, Christopher, went to Oklahoma, and they had kind of wanted my parents to come, but my parents had children and not the money to go twice from Sheldon to Wisconsin and then back to to Oklahoma, so they settled in Wisconsin. And our farm, did you want to know what kind of a farm it was?
Sure.
It was a dairy farm. It was only 80 acres, but we had dairy cows, Holsteins. Then they grew and harvested the hay. And there's quite a story about harvesting that we could talk about later. And then they grew oats and barley. And then also there was a time that we did contract work with a firm at Cumberland raising rutabagas, peas, and potatoes. That was quite interesting to grow up at that time of field work because the horses were used. There wasn't any tractor. There's a lot to talk about on that situation.
Okay. We'll probably come back to that later. Let's finish up here with your father. How did he cope during the hard times?
Well, my parents, they were content with what they had. They did not go into debt. You did without if you didn't have the money. I remember at the time they talked about the WPA work, and the men could go to work for the government and get some money. My father would not do that. He said, I have cows, I have milk, I have bread, I have cheese, I have meat. That's enough. I'm not going to on the government dole.
Okay.
He appreciated the freedom they had over here.
When and where did your father die, and how did he pass
Oh,
away?
my father died at home after retirement. He was very ill for several years. I believe that it was 1952 that he died. I'm not quite too sure this. And then he died at home at home. He refused to go to the hospital. He said, "No, I want to die home with Mama," and it did. He wanted to smell the coffee. He wanted to eat there, and they died together. I mean, he died in the presence of my mother taking care of him.
Did he have a doctor come out to visit him?
No.
Or just...
No, when it's time to die, it's time to die.
Okay. Let's talk about both your mother and your father now, together as your parents. How many children did they have altogether?
There were 12 children. My mother and father were married in 1899, August 31st, 1899. I think she was just going on to between 17 and 18 years. Well, I have to figure that out. But and then they had, my oldest sister was Ottilia, and born in I think I have it recorded somewhere, but I can't remember the birth of each of the sisters and brothers. And then they had August, the next one, and then Olga, and then Bertold. Bertold was 6 years old, and the oldest was 7 when they came to the United States. And how did she manage at 26 years of age, had four living children, but 2 babies died and are buried over into the Ukraine. those days my mother said that the families did the last service for the dead and bathed them and dressed them, and then they buried them in the little cemeteries near in their village, or Dorfs, as they called it. Then we had my sister Elizabeth was born in Sheldon, Iowa, where they first lived, and then Emma, 1913, and then they moved to Wisconsin, and then we had brother Gustav, another one, Erich, and Friedrich, and Elsie. I'm the last leaf on the family tree.
Okay. Who was the strict parent?
Depended upon which child needed the discipline. I can't tell you, but I think my father was with the boys. I know that. My father, I think, was a little softer for me. Probably because I was the youngest. They always shower the most attention on the youngest one.
Okay. And how would they discipline the children?
I think it was, sometimes I think it was a little threat with the strap. Whether it was carried out, I can't tell you for certain, but you'd have to ask the brothers, because if they used the strap, wasn't around. It might have been more of a threat. Or go and do some extra work. Or probably milk the cows by yourself. Or I don't know. The punishment had to finish the crime.
Okay. Were the punishments different between the boys and the girls?
Well, see, when I understand that when I was growing up, or a child, my oldest sister was married, as I have a niece that is 3 months older than I am. And then she needed help because she married young, and lived on the farm just a short distance from where my parents lived. And so my one sister, Elizabeth, and my brother, August, went to help with the chores and the babysitting and child training, help. Because those days, really, there was a lot of work to do with bread baking, bringing in the water, heating. Everything is hard work. And then my sister Olga was married before I remember, and I have, and then my brother Bert, after a while he had his own farm, so another brother went to help them out. So as I grew up, there was just a comfortable family.
Okay. Who influenced your life more, your mother or your father, and how so?
I think they each had their influence. I think my father taught me that your word should be good. And my mother, I think that tried to get an education, and as much as she wanted me to have a comfortable living, not to have to work as hard as she did.
Okay. How did your parents meet?
Oh, according to this, what we could get out of them is that my father must have seen my mother somewhere, and he was going to court her, but he couldn't go alone to visit her. So he had to have a companion, and they would go and call on my grandparents' home. And my mother would not meet him directly. She'd have to have a go-between, evidently, at first. But the grandparents were going to try out what kind of a fellow he was, so they would take out the bottle of schnapps or vodka and see how they would tolerate it, or whatever it was, as I get it. Must have been a little joke between them, you know. And then they were married. I don't know, a couple of years after. I don't know how long they courted.
Okay. And where were they living when they courted?
According to my records, my Brasilov was where they had some time, and then Ulyanovka, and I'm not just sure how that time between them. Now that my mother's gone, I just am so sorry that I didn't get more information. I did write down what she gave me a while ago, but when I was asked about this interview, I just didn't know that I could have time to collect all of that together in my own mind. So I might be off a few Dorfs, as they called it.
Okay. How long were your parents married?
My parents were married, well, I have a picture of them when they were married 50 years. I can't tell you if they were married, well, my father died in 52, so they would have been married 50, over 50 years anyway.
Could you please describe their marriage?
Well, they were amiable. If they had any discussions, it was in German, and I didn't understand it always.
Okay.
They never asked us, or as I understand it, it was just between the two of them. None of the children's problems. So it was their problem, not ours, if they had any differences.
What did your parents do for pastimes, hobbies, and such?
Well, as I say, we lived in a community with my aunt and her husband, uncle, lived about 2 miles from us, and they would come over, and the men would play pinochle, and then some other type of cards, I don't recall. And I asked my mother, why don't you play? She said, well, we had an argument once, and I decided it wasn't worth playing again. So she sat in her and crocheted or something, or visited with the women. I don't understand, did some lunch work, you know, provided lunch for them and so on. And the children would go out to play. But my father and I played checkers a lot. Enjoyed that. I can still remember after I was married and I went home to visit, and we sat in the house and around the kitchen table and played checkers till after midnight. He was a good checker player.
Okay. Were your parents involved in politics when you were younger?
No, I think they wanted to stay out of politics. They did have, well, I can say, because my uncle had newspapers, and they kept very current on what was going on during the war. Of course, I was too young to know that, and I do think that they would have discussions about what was happening over in Russia. What is happening now over there? Who's taking over? What's the future? And they were concerned about their relatives over there.
Okay. Did they ever think of going back over there if the circumstances changed?
The only time I heard them to speak of it, that I didn't know at the time, but I understand that my father said, well, I think I want to go back and visit again. Mother said, if you want to go, Louis, you go. I'm not going back. That's the end of the conversation. That's the end of what I know. But she was content to stay here with her children during the war and during the famine and that. She didn't want to hear about it. It was too hard on her emotions to think what happened to her family.
Okay. Do you have anything else you'd like to add about your parents that we haven't discussed yet?
I am very grateful that they came over here to give us the freedom. I think I had a happy childhood. Even though it was during the Depression that I grew up, we had good friends, we had a wonderful church, wonderful going to school, and we had family around, my brothers and sisters. We were content.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you had aunts and uncles around. Could you tell us about some of your aunts and uncles?
Well, as I understand it, that my father's sister, Christina, married over in the Ukraine, and her husband came from Germany, up on the north of Königsberg, and I often wondered, how in the world did they come from up northern Germany to the Ukraine and met and married? That one I was interested in, and I met a cousin, my aunt's Ray, and I asked him about it, and he said, well, I don't know much about why my father came down from northern Germany and then came into the Ukraine and met my mother and married and came over here. But they did have a cousin, and so. But I thought I was so pleased to have one aunt, so I cherished her, and she came over with several children, and I think they had 7 or 8. I have a picture of them, but the last picture they had, or that I have, was taken in Oklahoma when they went to visit a cousin, the cousin that came and moved there from Kansas on the Cherokee Strip. And I kept in touch with my aunt's children later in life, but my aunt and uncle, it was always a thrill when they came to visit, or I could go to visit them. My aunt fell in 1947 or 6, I don't remember, but she died from a broken hip. At that time in 1947, there was just nothing that could be done for a broken hip in an older person, as she was, so she died in a hospital in Wisconsin. And I was living I was married and had 2 children, and my husband was overseas in the service, and I went to visit a sister in St. Paul, and when my aunt died, and I couldn't go to the funeral, but my sister and her husband went, and I stayed home because of the children.
Okay. Where did they live when you were growing up?
My aunt and uncle?
Yeah.
They lived about 2 miles from us in Wisconsin, and they were one of the reasons that my father came to Wisconsin, to be close to relatives.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that they would visit. How often were these visits?
I don't know. I suppose when the Spirit moved them, and they would come by horse and buggy. I can't tell you. You know, when you're a kid, you don't pay attention to everything like that.
Okay. You told us earlier about that your you only had one aunt. Was she your favorite aunt or uncle?
Well, because of the blood connection, I think it was my auntie. I didn't call her auntie. She was always Tanta, Tanta Christine. And to this day, my nieces and nephews all call me auntie. But the one who is 3 months older than I am calls me Tanta, much to my dismay when we were kids and went to school together.
Why did that dismay you so much at school?
Pardon?
Why did that bother you at school?
Oh, what kid wants to be called an old German name by Tanta?
Okay. Could you tell me a little bit about your cousins?
My cousins, my aunt's my aunt's children. Yes. Let's see. I had a favorite cousin, Ray, and his wife, and he lived to be, I think, 90-some years old. I only got to know him more after I grew up and would go home for visits because we'd have family cousins gatherings. You know, you get to meet your cousins and so on. But he gave me some information about his parents coming over here and going to Baltimore. That's where their ship landed at Baltimore, and my parents' ship landed at Ellis Island or New York. They had my aunt and uncle had a nice farm and a nice house because he was also very much inclined to be a builder and built a nice 2-story wood house. And how I envied the cousins because they had a nicer home than we did because our home was built in the last end of the 1800s or somewhere along the line, 1900, and it wasn't as nice as the cousins had. But they were always glad to share when we visited them.
Okay. Do you have any childhood memories of Ray?
Of them?
Yeah.
Oh, just that they'd come over, and as I said, the aunt and uncle would play pinochle, and the kids and we would be playing games outside or whatever it was. But they were all older than I am now. As I say, the last leaf in the family, and also the last one of that generation of cousins.
Okay. What type of games would you guys play when they came to visit?
Well, I think we played dominoes, we played checkers, and I don't remember that we went out to play ball because the girls didn't play ball that time. They played with dolls. I don't recall too many other things that we did. Probably we read and told stories.
Okay. What type of dolls did you have?
A doll?
Yeah, what type of dolls did you mentioned dolls, what type were they?
Oh, well, I think it was, I only recall that I had one doll, but they probably, when we went to visit, had dolls. Mine was just a short little one and a small doll and homemade clothes. And you treasured it because it was only one doll you had for Christmas. I played more with my niece than I did with the cousins because the cousins were a couple of miles away and my niece is half a mile.
Okay. Can you tell me about any large family gatherings that occurred?
You mean with the aunt and uncle, or?
Um, yeah, your aunt and uncle, any of your extended family?
I think it was more or less that we met at church, because that was a good gathering place. And if they would come for anniversaries or birthdays, then that would be the time that we celebrated.
You mentioned that they lived 2 miles away. Um, how did your family stay in touch with one another?
Well, in our farm home, we had a wall telephone. And we could call through a central. You'd ring, and then the central would answer. Or if you were on the same line, you could ring and somebody would, on the same line, would answer. But if you got a call and answered, you could hear the receivers go up all along the line, and that was the way that people kept in touch and gossip what was going on in the neighborhood. I think ours was three long and three short. Now, I don't have any brothers or sisters left to challenge what I'm saying, so I hope my memory is right.
Um, how often was the gossip talk? Was that a very common practice for gossip?
Well, we didn't call it gossip, we just called it news on the telephone. But everybody found out if somebody was sick or needed help, or it was a good way to keep in contact with those on the same line. We didn't have electricity in the house, so I don't know, they had to have these separate telephone lines that came in.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your extended family members?
I'd almost have to refer to my notes that I had to refresh my memory. But it was a happy childhood and a good cousin relationship. And going back to my aunt and my cousins, all the correspondence that I had with one of the cousins' wives, a wife of one of my cousins, I kept a file of our correspondence and so on. And it was just recently, within this last month, that I called the widow of the last of my cousins, or my children of my aunt, and I said, I have all this file on your family and your mother-in-law and so on. Would you like it? And she said, I'd be delighted. So I packaged it and sent it to her. So I don't have that material to refresh mine, but she was pleased with it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about some of your siblings, and I was just wondering, how did you guys get along as you growing up with one another?
Well, as I say, I was the youngest one, so I must have had been favored. Little sister, after 4 brothers, older. Because my the other sister, Emma, had really, when she was able to, went to work in town and had her own apartment with other girls until she got married.
Okay. Even though that you're the youngest and you weren't there for any of their births, did you ever hear an interesting story about any of their births?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Elsie, if we could, let's start talking about religion. How important was religion to your childhood?
It was extremely important. And my parents were Lutheran, Evangelical Lutheran in the Ukraine. And they had what they called a larer, somebody who would come and teach them in the Bible and catechism. And that's their education over there was in a German school. And if they could read and write German and study the catechism until they were confirmed, that was almost the end of the education that they could get over there at that time. And then they carried on the Lutheran church when they came to Sheldon, Iowa. And incidentally, I have a picture of the church that my parents attended in Iowa. And my two sisters who were born in Iowa were baptized, and I'd like to show this to you. I received this later from the church. They're celebrating their 100th anniversary, and this is the little church that they attended. My sister, who was 95 and died 2 years or a year ago, when they were writing her obituary, of my niece, the only child living of hers, had this address, and she called the pastor to verify the baptism and the birth registered in that church. So I'm really quite pleased to have this, and so is my niece. And incidentally, I was thinking about carrying on that Lutheran faith when in my own family and siblings. And as I reviewed them, they all stayed Lutheran till they died, were buried in Lutheran faith. And I was very happy to be able to go to confirmation instruction, but I'll go back to how we attended church. We lived about 1.5 miles, not quite a half, because when we went to school it was 1.5 miles, and the church was shortly before, about 500 yards or 1/4 mile on the west end of the school. So we had our community together with church and school close by in our affairs. Well, the church was a nice church with a bell and a white clapboard. The pastor would come from, as I understood first, that we had a young pastor from the seminary that came and lived in about 2 miles, not 2 miles, in a short distance, in a house near the church. And we had when that pastor was called somewhere else, we had a pastor come out from Cumberland, which was about 5 or 6 miles, about 7 miles, and he came by a car. That when I remembered it, he came by car. But when we attended, we went by sleigh in the wintertime, and I don't remember now how we got there in the summertime, except we'd walk, and the sermons were in German most of the time, and I was, I think when I was in 7th grade, we started confirmation, and then in 8th grade we were confirmed. We had 2 years of instruction, but our instruction happened to be after our school let out in May, then the pastor would come and we would have 2 weeks, I believe 2 weeks of instruction. And it was the first time that we were able to be confirmed in English, my brother and myself. Prior to that, I know it was a hardship for my older brother two brothers, and they used to discuss that they'd have to be confirmed in German. Well, we attended church. My father was a elder, so he sat on the right hand of the pews along with all the men. The women sat on the left with the children. That was quite a scheme, wasn't it? So the fathers didn't have to do anything about disciplining the kids, that it was up to mother. And our pastors were hellfire and thunder, I tell you, when we went. So when I remember when I was a child and I'd go home and it was a beautiful sunset or something, I knew it was going to be the end of the world because it looked like it, and I was going to be real worried about hellfire, I tell you. That was ingrained in us. So we had a kind of maybe a fear, in a way, of a fearful God. But later it came to us that we knew he was a loving God. And this brings back to the memory before church. You know, on Saturday night was when you got ready to go to church the next day. So it was, we'll go back to that, what happened, the regular ceremonies that took place Saturday night, but we're talking about church right now. The church had a furnace. I remember that there was in the middle of the church, there was a grate of iron grate that the heat came up. And that was the only heating system that we had. But I know that that there was a good neighbor, member of the church, that would come early Sunday morning or maybe Saturday night and start the furnace going so that the church would be heated for us in the wintertime. Well, I also think that when we went to church with the horses in the wintertime, that my father would put blankets on the horses when we got to the church so that the horses would be warm standing in the cold. Where they were hitched, I don't know. And how they had so much room, I don't know. Those are puzzled to me. I keep thinking, how did all of them come? But some of them lived close by, you know, half a mile, but they all have it. In the wintertime, they had to come, you know, with a sled. And that was kind of fun for us kids, though, you know. Well, in the church, the liturgy was German. How do we understand all that, you know, to keep track? But I loved the German songs. Loved the German songs. And I did learn some German verses at Christmas time. Now, would you like to know about our Christmas at church?
Yes.
Well, Christmas was fun because we went to church dressed up in our Sunday best, anxious to see our classmates, anxious to get our pieces said. And of course, there was always the sack of candy that we waited for after church, which had hard candy, ribbon candy, and also an apple and an orange for Christmas. Of course, we children would kind of, what did you get? What did you get? Which was always interesting. And there might be exchange of Christmas presents at Christmas time. And I remember at Christmas how there would be a fresh Christmas tree brought in. And then for lights, they had the little clamp-ons with candles. And the tree would be lighted, would be having its illumination, which was beautiful, and we just sat there with starry eyes. There were men standing beside with us, tall, 6 foot or 5, depending upon the size of the tree, I suppose, with snuffers in case the wax melted down to the bottom and it would touch the needles. But there wasn't very much concern about that because these were freshly cut trees. I think about that. Now I'll think about confirmation. As I said, that it was my brother, Fred, and myself that were in the first class of confirmation in English. But I would like to show you that the first, before they decided, that we used this catechism, and I think it's a little worn. This one, it happens to be German. It was my brother's, and then I was to be heir. But then, even though we studied it in German, we were confirmed in English, which was fun. Then I have a picture of 14-year-olds. That's what we were in front of the church in July 13th, 1933. And that was a very emotional day when you took your own oath of confirmation. And I remember it very well that we were in, we had to answer the questions. And believe me, you had to answer the questions correctly or you'd hear about it later, you know. It was an emotional experience that you took your own oath. It had a lot of meaning to it, and it does to me to this day. And I'm thinking of, it was nice to go to church. There was always that warm feeling that you were with the community that believed as you did. I think of the baptism. I understand that when I was baptized, my mother told me there was another baptism at the same time, another girl. And so, because the other family had been at the church longer than my parents, they took that child as first for baptism. My mother made baptismal dresses. I know that because when she lived with us, she, in her 80s, late 80s, made, as she remembered, the dresses that she had made for the rest of the family. And I have a picture of the one that she made for her great-granddaughter, and it is all handmade except the lace at the bottom. She sewed this by hand of a very fine material, and we cherish this. The next Sunday in Billings, Montana, my granddaughter has a baptism of her third child, a boy, and I have asked her finally if he would be wearing this dress. So I'm going to wait and see, and she will be surprised if she sees this video someday whether or not he wore the dress. It may be because he's Thomas Christopher Shepherd III. It might be that a dress would not be appropriate, but I don't know. This will be interesting to know the outcome.
Okay, you mentioned earlier that your Sunday rituals kind of started Saturday night. What did you do Saturday night to prepare for church on Sunday?
Well, first of all, I think you had to, did you do your Sunday school lesson? Because after the formal church service, we had instruction for a while, I don't know, half hour or an hour. And the pastor would lead this kind of a confirmation questioning and so on. It wasn't really for confirmation, but it was just Sunday school. So we had to learn our pieces because we would be assigned another one for the next church time we'd go to church. But when I was thinking about the preparation was that Saturday night bath. That is a preparation. that was a separate preparation. This may not be the appropriate time to tell it. We'll go back to living in again, but it has quite a story of getting ready for the Saturday night path.
You can go ahead and elaborate if you'd like.
Pardon?
You said you can elaborate if you like.
Today?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it was quite, we had a pump that pumped water outside or in our pump house. Well, that had to be brought in and heated. We did have a reservoir on our stove, but there's also tea kettle and extra pans that would be heated with hot water. And then the wash tub would be brought in from the outside, whatever, and then filled with water. And being the only girl, I had the luxury of having it all by myself. And then I suppose it went out and refilled again with the cold water, and then the hot water from the tea kettle in the reservoir could be used for the next one. And we had wonderful clean clothes to put on, and I remember going to bed in a nice flannel nightgown. And my mother had heated the flat irons and wrapped them up and put them in the bed for me at night, which was a second story. This was winter time, Summertime, it was different because the brothers had arranged that they could have kind of a shower outside by putting tub of water up higher so the sun would, and then they could have a turn on and shower. It was different. Okay. Just little glimpses. Things change progressively better. And how wonderful it was when you got to go into a regular bathroom and shower and take a bath. That was luxury.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you put on nice clothes Saturday night before you went to bed. What type of clothes?
Flannel nightgowns. Yeah, flannel nightgowns for girls. I don't know if the boys, if they put on they aren't here to challenge me, but it seemed to me that maybe they had their clean winter underwear that they could, this is winter time, winter underwear that they could put on Saturday night and keep them warm, and then they would be halfway dressed the next day.
Okay, and what would you wear in both the summer and the winter to church on Sunday morning?
Well, I know that I wore a shoe and long stockings held up by a garter. Now you wouldn't know what a garter belt is today, the kind that Mother made, and then a cotton. And I remember sometimes that there was a black stockings, and we girls hated black stockings. We wanted either the white or the cream-colored cotton. And we wore dresses to church. I mean, I wore a dress, and the boys wore a pantsuit, and shirt.
How long did church usually last?
Too long sometimes. Sorry to say that, kids. But because I think that they wanted to give us the full admonishments. how sinful you are and what you're supposed to do, you know. So, as I say, I suppose it was hard for the mothers to keep the kids quiet. I remember one time I visited after I was growing up and came back to church, and there was an older pastor. I think he was near retirement or should have been, and he was from the pulpit, and some child was crying, and he just stopped in the middle of his sermon and said, "Mother, would you take that child out, please?" He had lost the trend of his sermon. I don't know how it would go today if one of our modern pastors would say, "Go into the crying room," or so. I don't know. That's up to the ushers, but not up to the pastor.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned your confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
What type of things were you required to learn, and did you have any tests you had to pass?
All of it. We had Luther's small catechism, and you learned the Lord's Prayer, the Articles, the creeds, and then the memorization, and sometimes the meaning of some of it. And to this day, I still can remember some of I remember many verses. And I think my mother also in her later years could recall what she learned in her psalms and songs and prayers. And now that I'm reaching her age, I can appreciate the memorization more than I did when I had to learn it.
Were you able to question any of these religious teachings that you learned in confirmation?
Oh, I didn't dare. You learned what the masters, the hair posture, would tell you. You don't question him, but you do question after you were old enough to think about for yourself.
Okay.
And I was really, as I was thinking about it, like I said, that all my siblings stayed with the Lutheran denomination, but different synods. Because one sister married a Norwegian, and she went into the Norwegian Lutheran Church. And then my oldest sister's grandsons are two ministers. But it was another synod. It wasn't the synod that I grew up in. So they didn't exactly tolerate each other's. And then, but as I said, but then the grandchildren, of course, turned into, married, in fact, a Catholic. And that was no for a while, you know, but now it's wonderful that we are brothers in faith. And then have Episcopalian, also have a Mormon, high priest, Catholic, as I say, Episcopalian, Methodist, several one is the, I can't think of it right now. Well, there's two branches of the Methodist Church anyway, but we're all can enjoy going to each other's church. I think I've covered most of those.
Okay. After you were confirmed, did your role in the church change at all?
Stronger. Mine has been stronger because I studied other religions. I had a library of all the books of the Mormons. I read them all. I have been given the last Catholic catechism that was published several years ago by Pope John, by a good Catholic friend. And let's see, I've been very interested in comparative religions.
Okay. Did your parents ever restrict you from anything because of religious reasons?
Oh yes, my pastor said, no, don't go to dance, you'll go to hell for sure.
Okay.
But drinking beer was okay. This I couldn't quite understand. That's okay. But that was tradition. That was a cultural thing. That was different. You could drink a beer.
Okay.
I didn't, though.
Did you have a Sunday dinner after church at all?
Sunday dinners were great. Mama would have, I always called my mother Mama and my father Papa. So if I refer to him as Mama, would have a wonderful dinner prepared for us, because the day before she would probably have butchered a chicken, and it was probably cold. We didn't have refrigeration, but we had a water tank with cold running water, and she could put that into the chicken into a basin and put it into the water tank, and it would be cold. And we did that with butter also, and milk enclosed. And then Sunday dinner we'd have roast chicken. Maybe the days before she had fried it too. I mean, several different ways to do it. Or canned chicken at certain times. Well, then we'd have always potatoes and gravy and meat. That was standard fare in a country home than ours. They would be boiled in mashed potatoes, and gravy made from, if we had roast beef or meat, or pork. It takes me a little while to kind of think about that, but it was good food. Vegetables from the garden. And for dessert, of course, we never had ice cream. Then we made it ourselves in the wintertime, because we had an ice cream freezer, and the kids would like to do that. We'd do that. And then when I was married, I bought an electric ice cream mixer. That took the fun out of grinding it yourself.
How was these Sunday dinners different from dinner of any other days of the week?
And a little special, a little special, because we'd often have company coming. But then that one chicken, Mama would say, oh, I like the neck, I like the gizzard. She would always take that instead of the good food. That was my mother. She was very generous and kind.
Okay.
Oh, we had Jell-O too. I remember that we had Jell-O, and that was a treat. And that was prepared the night before, because it had to be over to gel. And then we had whipped cream on top of that from the cream from the cows.